Hi, this is Mr. Yates reading Chapter 10, Meet Mr. Jefferson from Book 4 of our U.S. History. On a Monday in March 1801, Thomas Jefferson sat down to breakfast at his usual seat at the end of a long table at Conrad M. McMunn's boarding house in Washington, D.C., where he paid $15 a week for a room and 3 meals a day. The morning was cold and it was a special day, so someone offered him a seat near the fireplace. No, thank you, said Jefferson, who would accept no favors. He meant to be a Democratic president, a man of the people. It was later that very day that he walked up the hill to the Capitol and was sworn in as the third president of the United States. Afterwards, in a quiet voice, he read his inaugural address. Most of those listening were surprised by what he said. They expected something strong and startling from the man who had defied England with his great declaration. Jefferson had spent the past years fighting the Federalists and Federalist ideas. Now he stood before them and said, "Let us unite with one heart and one mind. With every difference of opinion, it is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." It was an appeal for unity and goodwill. It set the tone for his presidency. What was it about this man that made him so special? He wasn't a soldier. He was not a good orator. He was shy. He didn't pretend to be anything he was not. Perhaps it was that Jefferson looked for the good in people. He appealed to the best instincts in his countrymen and countrywomen, and they knew it. He was himself a combination of the best this country had. His father was a farmer. His mother came from the Virginia planter aristocracy. From them, he got a superb education and learned responsibility, good manners, and to be generous. Jefferson wanted a government that would interfere as little as possible with people's lives. He cut taxes, reduced the size of the military, and balanced the budget. People liked him. One group of Massachusetts Baptists liked him so much that they decided to make a cheese for him. Their minister, John Leland, got the idea. Here's what they did in the words of someone who was there. Every man and woman who owned a cow was to give for his cheese all the milk yielded on a certain day. Only no federal cow must contribute a drop. A huge cider press was fitted up to make it in, and on the appointed day the whole country turned out with pails and tubs of curd, the girls and women in their best gowns and ribbons, and the men in their Sunday coats and clean shirt collars. The cheese was put to press with prayer and hymn singing and great solemnity. When it was well dried and weighed 1,600 pounds, it was placed on a sleigh, and Elder Leland drove it with all the way to Washington. It was a journey of 3 weeks. All the country had heard of the big cheese and came out to look at it as the elder drove along. That was one gift the Democratic president couldn't refuse. It was called the Mammoth cheese, and everyone seemed to know about it. A poet wrote, "Some said 'twas Jefferson's intent to erect it as a monument." The cheese must have come in handy. It arrived in 1801 and was so enormous that in 1805 they were still serving it up at presidential receptions. President Jefferson's receptions were different from those of his predecessors. Mostly Jefferson gave small, informal dinners. But on New Year's Day and the 4th of July, the president's house was open to any citizen who wanted to meet the president. On ordinary mornings, if you had business to do with the government, you could stop by. Jefferson issued orders to his staff that all visitors, farmers, and gold-braided diplomats should receive the same courtesy. There was to be no favored treatment in a democracy. But when everyone was left to find his or her own seat at the president's table, there was so much pushing and shoving that, finally, seating charts had to be made. When he had someplace to go, President Jefferson rode on horseback, without a guard. He had no use for the elegant presidential coach. He chose his friend James Madison to be Secretary of State and Swiss-born Albert Gallatin as Secretary of the Treasury. As you know, many people say that Federalist Alexander Hamilton was the best Secretary of Treasury ever. Well, others say the same of Republican Albert Gallatin. Gallatin said the national debt was more dangerous to America than the risk of foreign aggression. The debt and the military budget had risen during John Adams' presidency. Gallatin reduced the military budget and cut the debt almost in half. Jefferson believed he was involved in a revolution. He believed he was taking the nation back to the democratic spirit of 1776. Actually, he didn't change things as much as he thought he did. The country he led was in no danger of becoming a monarchy. George Washington and John Adams had enjoyed riding in a fancy coach, but they were Republicans. They cherished this people's government. And the Federalists, who had predicted terrible things from the man they had screamingly described as a radical, were surprised. They had forgotten that Jefferson was a gracious country gentleman with fine taste and a belief in the goodness of men and women. The nation didn't fall apart under a Democratic Republican administration. But when Thomas Jefferson went shopping and brought a huge piece of land for the nation, some people thought it extravagant. Jefferson bought all the land that France claimed in North America. That land, the French called it Louisiana because their king was named Louis, went from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and maybe beyond. No one was sure how far it went. Jefferson spent $15 million on the Louisiana Purchase, which amounts to about 4 cents an acre. With that purchase, he doubled the size of the country, and he did it peacefully. It was a great bargain, although at the time many thought it was worthless and unneeded. If President Jefferson hadn't bought that land, those of you who live in Missouri and Iowa and Nebraska and a lot of other states might all be speaking French today. The Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803. That is a date to remember. The Mississippi was no longer controlled by a foreign power. Once the United States purchased Louisiana Territory, someone had to find out what it had bought. How big was the territory? What was it like? And where did it end? Jefferson sent an expedition to investigate. Before I write about that exploring expedition, I have something awful to tell you. It happened in 1804. A duel took place with pistols. Today, dueling is against the law, and the law is enforced. Then, people with arguments sometimes tried to shoot out their differences. Aaron Burr was angry at Hamilton because Hamilton had supported Thomas Jefferson for president instead of Burr. Alexander Hamilton supported Thomas Jefferson? Can that be true? Weren't they rivals? Yes, they were, but Hamilton was the kind of man who wanted to vote for the best qualified person. He knew Jefferson would make a better president than Burr. Besides, he couldn't stand Burr, who had once been a Federalist and then switched to the Democratic Republican Party. But it was Burr who challenged Hamilton to a duel. There are several different stories about that duel. People still argue about the details, but there's no arguing about the outcome. Burr's shot killed Alexander Hamilton, and everyone agrees that Hamilton was a man of rare talent and integrity who loved his country. His death was a tragedy for the nation.